All right, let's dive right into a big one. It's probably one of the most heated debates of all time. God, logic, and belief. Can they actually coexist? We're going to try and break it down.
So here's the question at the heart of it all. Can a truly logical person be a believer? Is faith inherently illogical? Or is there a way for a rational thinking person to also have faith? It feels like a question that forces you to pick a side, right?
Yeah, and usually we see this whole debate in black and white. You've got the radical atheist on one side, who's absolutely certain God does not exist. And then on the other side, the radical theist, who is just as certain that God does exist. But here's the thing. A truly logical approach shows that both of these extreme positions are, well, standing on surprisingly shaky ground.
Okay, so to really unpack this, we first have to talk about a fundamental rule in any logical argument. It's called the burden of proof. Basically, who needs to prove what?
And this leads us to a really core principle in logic. The rule is actually super simple. Whoever makes a positive claim, that something exists, is the one who has to provide the proof. It's not on everyone else to prove a negative, to prove that it doesn't exist. Think about it like this. Imagine I tell you there's an invisible red line of light between us right now. You'd probably say, I don't see it. And if I then demanded that you prove it isn't there, you'd be right to call that totally illogical. The burden is on me, the one making the claim, to prove it's real. Well, the exact same logic applies when someone makes the positive claim, God exists. So if both the extreme atheist and the extreme theist are making these claims of certainty without any real, definitive proof, where does that leave a logical person? Well, it kind of points them towards a middle path, right? A space that's a bit more intellectually honest, somewhere between those two extremes.
And that brings us to the most well-known middle ground, agnosticism. See, an agnostic doesn't pretend to have the final answer. They look at the arguments from both sides and basically conclude that, hey, neither side has really proven their case, so logically, they just suspend their judgment. Their position is essentially, I don't know, and I'll wait until there's some conclusive evidence one way or the other. But being an agnostic isn't the only option here. It's really a spectrum. You've also got the skeptic, who doubts claims but doesn't totally reject them. They're just waiting for more clarity. And then there's this really fascinating third option, the practical believer. This is someone who makes a conscious choice to believe for reasons that have almost nothing to do with evidence. And that leads to a really, really interesting idea. If you can't logically prove or disprove that God exists, then maybe, just maybe, the decision to believe isn't about evidence at all. Maybe it's about something else, like practicality. So if you're a logical person and the evidence and pure reason just lead to a dead end, what do you do? What tools do you have left? Well, some of history's greatest thinkers said you just have to shift your focus. Instead of trying to analyze evidence for God, you can logically analyze the consequences of believing in God. Let's check out two big arguments for this. First, you've got Blaise Pascal, a brilliant scientist and mathematician from the 17th century. He framed the whole thing as a cost-benefit analysis. Then, a few centuries later, the psychologist William James came at it from a totally different angle. He was interested in the practical, psychological value that belief can bring to your life, things like a sense of peace or humility. This quote right here just perfectly sums up Pascal's famous wager. His whole argument was, look, if you believe in God and you turn out to be wrong, you haven't really lost anything. But if you don't believe and you turn out to be wrong, you risk, well, everything. So from a purely pragmatic risk management point of view, he saw belief as simply the most logical bet to make. Okay, but wait, there's one more crucial layer to this whole puzzle. Because whether or not a belief is logically consistent can depend entirely on the kind of God we're even talking about. So let's compare two really different concepts of God. On one hand, you have the idea of a personal God, which in some traditions is called Sagun. This is a God with attributes we can relate to, powerful, merciful, kind. This brings a ton of emotional comfort, but it's really hard to defend with pure logic. Then, on the other hand, you have the concept of an impersonal God, or Nirgun. This is more like a formless, abstract force that's defined only by what it's not. Now, this idea is way more logically sound and hard to argue against, but it doesn't offer much in the way of emotional connection. And just to be clear, personal doesn't have to mean a God with a physical body. Think about the God in Islam or Christianity, for example. That God is formless, but is still considered a personal or Sagun God because he is described with attributes like mercy and justice and love. So, where does all this leave us? What's the big takeaway here?
Well, maybe the true sign of a logical mind isn't what you conclude in this whole debate, but how you hold that belief. Maybe it's all about valuing openness over absolute, rigid certainty. Think about it. The truly logical thinker, whether they lean towards belief or not belief, is someone who acknowledges that there isn't definitive proof either way. They avoid the traps of radical, absolute certainty. And, probably most important, they stay open-minded. They're ready and willing to actually change their position if new, compelling evidence ever shows up. And that brings us to one final thought, a more personal one for you to consider. Maybe the real question isn't what you believe, but how rigidly you believe it. In other words, how open are you right now to the possibility that you just might be wrong?